An article from Our Commons state that Canada is a parliamentary democratic state, meaning that the law is what governs the nation. This was enacted by the Constitution Act in 1867, which is the foundation of Canada's government system. This act states that there will only be one parliament that consists of the Crown, Senate, and the House of Commons. It is also a constitutional monarchy state, as a representative of the Queen, the Governor General makes the final decision. At the macroscopic level, there exist three government entities: the federal, provincial, municipal governments. At all levels, the government contains the three branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. In the following, I shall use the federal government as an example to describe these divisions with information obtained from the articles from Canada Guide, Prime Minister, House of Commons, Senate, and Judiciary. At the executive level lies the Prime Minister, current Justin Trudeau, and the Cabinet. The Prime Minister is elected through a nationwide election, and he or she selects the Cabinet Ministers who take responsibility for a specific department in Canada, such as finance, justice, defense, and foreign affairs. The Prime Minister is selected from the party with the majority vote in said election, and he or she is responsible for representing Canada nationally and internationally, passing amending laws, and handling matters of national security. By Constitution, the Prime Minister reports to the Queen of England through the Governor General. The legislative branch comprises of the Senate and House of Commons. Both houses consist of politicians who convene regularly to vote for the passage/amendment of laws and discuss matters of state. The party with the most number of members of Parliament in the House of Commons, the dominant portion of the legislature, is considered the majority. This is the Cabinet. Finally, the judicial branch refers to the courts. These are comprised of judges who are presented with requests from the above two branches for reforms to the Constitution and decide whether such requests should be accepted or denied. As reported by courthouse libraries, in order for a bill or a policy to be officially introduced as a law, it is usually introduced in the House of Commons. After it passes the House of Commons through two readings, it is sent to the committee to be reviewed. In the committee, members study the bill clause by clause and makes amendments. The committee then sends a report with recommendations for a third reading to finalize the bill. This bill is now reviewed by the Senate through a similar process. If the Senate approves this bill, it is then sent for a final approval by the Governor General, who represents the monarch in Canada. The last step is largely a formality, and since the Constitution Act of 1867, the Crown has never disapproved a bill presented by the Canadian legislature. The official government website of Canada states that this structure, consisting of the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, also exists at the level of the provincial governments. The majority party in each province's legislature is led by the Premier and Associated Cabinet, while laws proposed at the provincial level need final approval by the Lieutenant Governor General of that province. So what is the polarizing issue? The polarizing issue that Canada is divided from is the creation of a second pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia, Canada. Alberta is Canada's main oil producer with 166.3 billion barrels of oil in the form of oil sands. The oil supply is also the main economic source in Alberta, but because there is an oversupply of oil and the oil produced in Canada is not favorable in the global market, Alberta is facing economic consequences. This is significant because Alberta contributes significantly to the Canadian economy, and if there is deflation in the main economic source in Alberta, Canada cannot avoid severe economic consequences. During the past 50 years, Alberta refused to diversify their economy because oil brought huge economic benefits. However, there is an oversupply of oil compared to the demand, which decreases the price of oil. Furthermore, Canada's oil is not favorable in the global market, so Canada is facing economic consequences because of the inability/small economic benefits when exporting oil. However, the only way for Canada to access Alberta's oil is by the construction of a rail. Therefore, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau proposed the creation of a second pipeline in response to the difficulties in investment and price of the oil to increase the production and export of oil to the Asian market. The research conducted by CNBC Kat Eschner states that this project cost Canada $4.5 billion and another $7.4 billion to construct the TMX, which is the name of the pipeline. However, it will allow for the increase in daily transport of 300,000 barrels of oil to 890,000. The government's perspective on this policy. Trudeau and other members of the government approves the construction of the pipeline because they expect significant economic returns and profits. According to the article, Project Benefits by Trans Mountain website, the Conference Board of Canada estimates that Canada will have a government revenue of $46.7 billion over 20 years. Over 20 years, British Columbia, receiver of oil from Alberta, receives $5.7 billion, Alberta $19.4 billion, and Canada $21.6 billion. Furthermore, this project will provide an increase in employment opportunities during construction and operation. It is estimated that there will be 15,000 jobs per year during construction and 37,000 per year for operations. Canada also envisions the money gained from this project to invest and fund community programs, infrastructure, education, and the environment, allowing this benefit to be extended to many more aspects of Canada's welfare. Most importantly, this policy provides the much needed time for Alberta to regain its economy and diversify its source of income rather than relying heavily on solely oil. An article from CBC reports that Alberta is a significant contributor to Canada's economy, but because Alberta's economy has gone under recession due to the deflation of oil prices, Canada is desperate for Alberta to regain its economic stability. From this CBC article, Canada earned $380 billion in internal trade prior to the recession, and Alberta contributed $75 billion to it. Also, Trevor Toome, an analyst from University of Calgary, state that if Alberta's recession never happened, there would be a $13 billion boost in the GDP. Considering the fact that the federal deficit is $14 billion, the federal deficit would not have happened if Alberta never went to recession. Toome also stated that Canada missed out on $130 billion due to Alberta's recession. As the overabundance of oil in Canada was the leading problem to Alberta's recession, Canada is trying to transport more oil out from Alberta to reduce the supply and therefore prevent the deflation of oil. The opposition's perspective on this policy. However, there are severe backlashes from Indigenous tribes of Canada, referred to as First Nation, citizens, and other members of the Members of Parliament due to environmental concerns and social concerns regarding the citizens of the First Nation. In fact, the Wilderness Committee affirms that the Tsleil-Waututh Nation of Canada estimates that there are 79% to 87% chances of oil spilling into the water in the next 50 years, and two-thirds of the First Nations impacted due to construction. There is also a social concern because these lands have significant meanings to the First Nation, culturally, historically, socially, politically, and spiritually, according to Northern Affairs Canada. The Indian Act acknowledges that the land indeed is meaningful to the First Nation and agrees that these lands are owned/controlled by these people. However, if the TMX project continued, it would not only displace the indigenous people but steal the land that they have lived in for generations. In addition to the First Nation, Canadian citizens and some members of the Parliament are concerned due to environmental issues. As stated by the Wilderness Committee, the worst case scenario, which they predict will occur at a probability of 29%, 100,000 barrels of oil will spill into the ocean. According to Kat Eschner from CNBC, there are further environmental concerns with the TMX pipeline expansion project, including the impact it has on Canada's fisheries. It is estimated that the climate change from the TMX will cause the stock loss of between 30 to 60% of Canada's fish, such as the Pacific herring and the Atlantic cod. Additionally, the Stockholm Environment Institute predicts that expanding Canadian oil sands production could increase global emissions by 50 million to 150 million tons of CO2 annually by 2030. Furthermore, the 2018 International Panel on Climate Change states that the global warming could exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. However, Barrington Lay states that if the pipeline is built, it will ramp up production over the longer term. It will be next to impossible for Canada to meet its Paris Climate Agreement commitments and help keep warming below this level. Therefore, the environmental consequences that follow the construction of the pipeline is not ignorable in today's society. Is the decision-making process fair? The decision-making process of approving the pipeline project is more than fair, as the final decision, is not made by the Prime Minister himself. Unlike different democratic states where the President makes the final approval, the Prime Minister's vote is just one of the many votes within the Parliament. His or her vote does not make that significant of a factor in deciding which bills are passed or rejected. Instead, Canada has a balance between the main party in power, the Cabinet, and other parties such as the Opposition House. Each member of the Parliament contributes equally in deciding if a new law will be introduced or not. Furthermore, Financial Post stated that the decision to approve the Canadian TMX pipeline project did not yet take place due to the appeal from the Canadian court. This appeal was about the Canadian government fulfilling their duty of informing the First Nation about the TMX project. As stated from Financial Post, the federal government stated that Canada withheld their evidence and legal submissions on these points. Therefore, 6 First Nations will speak up to challenge the proceedings of the TMX project. Do I support this policy? I do not support the TMX project because although it may provide economic benefits at first, it damages the environment and the First Nation in order to do so. Although the Canadian government says that after they invest more than $12 billion in the project, they will receive more than $70 billion in return, this cannot compensate for the environmental damages that were caused during this period. Once the environment is damaged, trees destroyed, or temperature increased, it is impossible to turn back and make up for the change. Furthermore, Canada has also prioritized economic gain over symbolic, meaningful, and cultural land from the First Nation. As mentioned previously, the land that the First Nation inhabit has been the home of their ancestors and also contains spiritual meaning for their tribe. Therefore, it is unethical to steal the rightful property of another nation, merely under the false shades of national gain. Finally, the Canadian government has to invest $12 billion for an uncertain economic gain 20 years later. Currently, Canada is in a $14 billion deficit, but if it takes 20 years to make up for it, the project is definitely not worth it. How do I improve the situation? In order to improve the situation, Canada has to invest $12 billion in different sectors of Canada. Canada will be able to maximize its profits by investing in sectors that bring the greatest economic gain, such as the manufacturing industry and specifically transportation, communication, and construction industry. Manufacturing industry is crucial to Canada's economy, and the Canadian visa states that this industry brings $174 billion for Canada, which is more than 10% of the GDP, and maintaining 1.7 million jobs. However, because of Canada's aging population, there has been an increase in the labor shortages in this sector. As Canada is introducing skill and vocational training to its employees, it would be best to invest some money into these programs and the rest in repaying the country's federal deficit.